Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the folds of history lie stories that were never meant to surface, stories whispered only in shadows, buried in silence because they are too painful, too grotesque, too unspeakable. Tonight, you will hear one of them. A girl, born not from love but from the sickness of a family line collapsing in on itself. She carried a child that should never have been conceived, not from a stranger, not from a man who courted her hand, but from her own brother. Her name has nearly been erased, her memory left to rot in yellowing pages and rotting ledgers, but her suffering, her unimaginable suffering, still lingers in the soil where her blood once spilled. This is not fiction. This is the haunting truth of the most inbred girl in history. Imagine growing up in a world so small, so cut off from the outside, that your only companions are the faces of your kin. Imagine the walls of your house holding not protection, but a curse that grows heavier with each generation. For this girl, there was no world beyond the creaking porch and dirt road. Her life was dictated by silence, by obedience, by the twisted belief that blood must never leave the bloodline. That it was better to wither from within than risk letting the family name scatter into the world. She was not a daughter in her father's eyes, she was property. She was not a sister in her brother's eyes, she was a vessel. And when her body began to change, when the sickness of her womb carried a child that was both her nephew and her son, the neighbors turned away. They did not ask. They did not save her. They let her rot in plain sight because they knew the truth and feared it. The truth that this was not an accident, not a crime of passion, but a generational sentence carried out with cruel precision. Her story is more than a tragedy. It is a mirror of the darkest corners of American history, where isolation bred monsters not from the outside world, but from within. Tonight, I will take you there. To the forgotten farmhouse, to the cries that never left the night air, to the shame buried under gravestones without names. And when we are finished, you may wish you never heard it. But once you do, you will never forget. The girl's life began, as most do, in innocence. But innocence cannot survive in a house where secrets are thicker than air. Her family lived in the shadow of poverty and superstition, tucked away from towns and strangers, where suspicion of outsiders was treated as gospel. To them, the bloodline was all that mattered. Marriage beyond it was betrayal. Outsiders brought shame, contamination, the threat of losing what little control the family still clung to. And so the circle tightened with each generation until the children bore the faces of deformity, sunken eyes, crooked jaws, bodies twisted under the weight of their own ancestry. She was born into that prison, and she would never escape it. Her father's word was law, his silence more terrifying than his rage. He believed, as his father before him, that daughters were meant to serve, that a girl was not meant to choose her fate, but to carry the will of the bloodline within her body. When she was barely a woman, her brother, older, hardened, already twisted by the same beliefs, took her as if it were his right. The first time she cried. The second time she stopped. By the third, she understood there would be no end to it. For in that house, her body was no longer her own, it belonged to the family. When her belly began to swell, the whispers started. Neighbors who dared glance too long saw what could not be hidden. They spoke quietly among themselves, their voices laced with disgust and fear, but none confronted the family. No preacher came to condemn it. No lawman knocked on their door. In those days, in places like this, shame was dealt with not through justice, but through silence. And so the girl carried her burden beneath tattered dresses, her eyes hollowing as the weeks turned to months. She was not a mother in waiting. She was a sacrifice. Inside the home, no comfort was offered. Her brother looked at her not with regret, but with ownership. Her father turned his eyes away, pretending not to know the truth he had allowed. The girl's mother, weary and broken from years of her own servitude, said nothing at all. It was as if the walls themselves demanded her silence, as if every creak of the wooden floorboards whispered, "Endure, endure, endure." The child grew inside her, carrying the curse of too much sameness, too much decay within its very blood. And though she prayed in secret that it would not survive, that her suffering would end with her, fate had other plans. The day of her labor came in silence, as though the earth itself refused to acknowledge what was about to unfold. No midwife was called, no neighbor summoned. She was laid upon a thin mattress in a room that smelled of mildew and despair, her body trembling as waves of pain ripped through her. There were no gentle hands to soothe her brow, no voices to reassure her that she would survive. Only her mother stood nearby, not as comfort, but as a silent witness to a cycle she had endured herself. A cycle passed down like a curse, binding mother to daughter, daughter to unborn child. The girl screamed, but the walls absorbed her cries. No one outside the house heard, or if they did, they chose not to act. The child emerged into the world frail, its features already marked by the weight of generations collapsing inward, eyes that did not align, a jaw too small, limbs trembling with weakness. The girl's tears fell not from joy, but from terror. She knew what this meant. The curse had not ended. It had been born anew, and it was hers to carry. Her brother came to see the child, and in his eyes there was not horror, not shame, but pride. Pride that the bloodline had not been broken, that the family's twisted oath had been upheld. He touched the infant with the same hand that had stolen her innocence, and in that moment the girl realized she was not merely a victim, she was a prisoner of fate. There would be no escape. Her child would grow, and in time perhaps be subjected to the same torment she had endured. The neighbors saw the child only from afar, wrapped in blankets, its cries echoing down the dirt roads like a warning. They shook their heads, muttered prayers under their breath, but they never interfered. To acknowledge the truth would mean confronting the rot festering at the heart of their community. Easier, safer, to pretend it was not happening. Easier to bury there, a horror in silence. And so the girl raised the child with hands that trembled, her heart hollow. Each day she looked into the child's mismatched eyes and saw both her brother and herself staring back. She could not hate it, yet she could not love it. It was not merely her child, it was the embodiment of her entrapment. The curse of the family had not been broken. It had simply been reborn in another body, destined to repeat what should never have been. As the years crawled forward, the girl's body bore the toll of her suffering. She was still young, but her face aged quickly, her spirit drained by the endless weight of shame. Her child clung to her skirts, fragile, often ill, its growth stunted by the poison of blood that was too closely shared. Every cough, every fever, every fainting spell reminded her that she had birthed not a blessing, but a continuation of the family's decay. The whispers outside their home never stopped. Villagers spoke of curses, of God's wrath, of sins that bred sickness. Yet still, no one came to break the cycle. Silence protected the guilty, and silence condemned the innocent. Her brother, emboldened by the power he held, did not stop at one. To him, she was no longer a sister, no longer a human being, merely a vessel, existing only to keep the family's blood sealed within its own poisoned circle. Each pregnancy carved away pieces of her soul until she became a hollowed shell of a girl, drifting through days like a ghost in her own life. By the time she was barely into her 20s, she looked twice her age. Sunken cheeks, eyes dull with despair, hands trembling as though she had already lived a lifetime of agony. And yet, no one lifted a hand to stop it. No church bell rang to call judgment down upon the family. No law reached into the dirt roads that led to their crumbling farmhouse. They existed beyond consequence, protected not by power or wealth, but by neglect. In America's forgotten corners, such horrors thrived because no one wanted to see them, and so she was left to wither. Her children, weak and frail, bore the same haunting features: eyes too close, jaws misaligned, voices strained. They were living proof of a sin that should never have been allowed to flourish, and yet they played in the yard like any other children, unaware that their very existence carried a curse. The Giend, well, now a mother many times over, watched them with a hollow ache, knowing what the future held. She could not imagine them escaping a fate she herself had never been allowed to escape. Each night, when the house grew quiet, she would sit by the window and stare into the dark, whispering prayers that no one heard. Prayers not for her own deliverance, but that her children might find a way out, that they might be the last to suffer. But the walls of that house were unyielding, and the blood, once tainted, demanded its toll. Time has a way of erasing names, but not sins. As the girls' children grew, the weight of their lineage showed in their faces. Some bore the telltale marks of deformity more severely than others. A twisted spine here, a slack jaw there, eyes that seemed unable to focus on the same point at once. Their very existence betrayed the secret their family tried so hard to contain. The neighbors, those who still dared to look, whispered darker tales now. They called the house cursed, haunted, damned. Mothers pulled their children away from the road that passed by. Men crossed themselves when they heard the children's laughter, for it sounded too strange, too broken. Yet still no one intervened. Silence remained the town's shield. Perhaps they feared divine punishment, or perhaps they simply didn't care enough to confront what lived in the shadows of their own community. And so the girl, no longer a child, no longer truly free, watched her brood grow with both love and dread. Each of them was a piece of her, but also a reflection of everything she wished she could forget. Her brother's control over her life never wavered. He walked with a cruel confidence, as though the world belonged to him, as though the suffering he inflicted was not an abomination, but a duty. He was not just her abuser. He was the patriarch in waiting, the one destined to carry their father's twisted beliefs into the next generation. And the girl knew, when her children were old enough, the cycle would continue, fed by his hand. Her daughters would face her same fate. Her sons would be taught the same poisonous creed. The bloodline would tighten again, coil around itself, until nothing pure remained. It was in these years that despair settled into her bones. She rarely smiled. She rarely spoke. Neighbors who glimpsed her said she moved like a shadow, her body hunched, her eyes vacant, her hands trembling heavy. And when still, it was as though her spirit had already died, and only her flesh walked on. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent like the neighbors, or would you have tried to break the cycle, even at the risk of your life? The girl never got that choice. Silence was forced upon her, and silence has always protected the guilty far more than the innocent. Years slipped away like dust on the wind, and the girl's body, still young by any measure, carried the ruins of a soul destroyed long before its time. By now she had become little more than a husk, her face lined and hollow, her eyes staring at nothing for long stretches of time. Her children, frail as they were, clung to her in ways that were both tender and heartbreaking. They loved her, for she was their only comfort in a world that had abandoned them. And yet every embrace, every soft word was stained by the knowledge of who had sired them, of what blood coursed through their veins. She could never look at them without feeling the sharp edge of both love and loathing. The family house decayed with them. Its walls sagged, its roof leaked, and its yard grew wild. It was not merely a home anymore. It was a tomb where generations of suffering were buried alive. Strangers who passed by avoided even glancing toward it, as though their very eyes might be cursed by what they saw. Still, inside, the cycle spun on. Her brother's dominance grew crueler with age, hardened by arrogance and a sense of destiny. He was the keeper of the bloodline now, and he wielded that role like a weapon. Some say the girl tried to end her own life more than once, that she slipped into the woods with a length of rope, or that she let herself wander into the cold, hoping never to return. But each time something drew her back. Perhaps the cries of her children, perhaps the unbearable thought of leaving them to face their fate alone. Survival in her case was not hope, it was punishment. By the time she bore her final child, her body was broken beyond repair. Her womb, scarred and weakened, bled for days. She lingered on the edge of death, neither living nor gone, her children watching in silence as her life drained from her. And in those hours, she is said to have whispered words no one could fur. Surely here, pleas to God, to death, to anyone who might break the curse. But no one answered. When she finally passed, there was no mourning, no ceremony, no stone, no marker to bear her name. She was lowered into the earth like an animal, covered in soil that would soon forget her. Only her children remembered, and they carried her suffering within them, in their very blood, long after her body was gone. Death should have freed her, but even the grave did not sever the chains of her bloodline. Her children remained in that crumbling house, raised beneath the same roof that had stolen their mother's soul. Her brother, now both father and patriarch, tightened his grip on them, bending them into the same twisted cycle he had forced upon her. The daughters inherited their mother's fate, their bodies becoming vessels for a curse they could not escape. The sons inherited the cruel authority of their father, carrying forward the same sickness of thought, the same warped devotion to keeping the blood pure. And so the nightmare did not end. It multiplied. The neighbors, by now, no longer whispered, they simply avoided. They let the family rot in its isolation, convinced that to intervene was to invite the curse upon themselves. And so the children grew like weeds in a garden no one tended, twisted and bent toward the sun, but never truly thriving. Their features bore the undeniable proof of their origins, and their eyes carried the haunted look of those who had seen too much suffering for their years. Generations passed this way, each one feeding upon the other, each one collapsing further inward. The story of the girl who carried her brother's child became less a memory and more a legend, something muttered with a shiver by those who lived nearby, then carried forward by travelers who heard it second-hand. A tale so grotesque, so unthinkable, that it blurred the line between history and horror. But make no mistake, it was no ghost story. It was flesh and blood. It was real. And as with all stories too dark to face, it was allowed to sink beneath the surface, hidden away in forgotten records and family Bibles tucked deep into rotting trunks. Until now. What remains of her is not a name carved into stone, but a warning carved into silence. A warning about what happens when shame replaces justice, when silence feeds evil, when the ties of family become chains instead of bonds. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, but above all, she was a prisoner of blood. Her story lingers not because it was preserved, but because the earth itself seems to remember, every crumbling house left abandoned, every crooked smile passed down a line, every whisper of a family that never let the blood escape. And now you too carry it. You have seen what you were never meant to see.